Tanaka ni Timt, Niat Ensley Guffey, Archivist ye Iswang. Hey everybody, my name is Ensley Guffey and I'm the archivist for the Catawba Nation. The Catawba Nation Archives is the only archive in the world solely dedicated to collecting and preserving and making available Catawba materials beyond the normal reams and reams of paper documents and artifacts that most archives have. As a tribal archive, we have definitely some multimedia things, a ton of Catawba pottery. The Catawba pottery tradition is the oldest non-broken pottery tradition in North America, period. Catawba potters are still making pottery the way their ancestors did 6,000 years ago. So we have a lot of pottery from various different eras. We also have feathers and regalia, skins, lots of projectile points and other Neolithic artifacts. So not to mention various media from reel-to-reel audio tapes to Betamax cassettes, if you remember those from the pre-VHS era, many of which part of my big job recently has been getting that digitized and making that available online. You can find the archives website at it's archives at catawbaculture.org. So check it out there. Now, a lot of the stuff on the archives is restricted to citizen access only, particularly things dealing with how pottery and the clay is processed, and some of our traditional dances are kind of sensitive cultural information, but there's a lot of good stuff out there that you can access. So we encourage you to go out. And of course, the archives is open by appointment only, Wednesday through Friday. You're welcome to get in touch with me at archives@catawba.com, and we'll make an appointment. You can come and do a little research. So here we are. I've spieled on for a while. I'm here to talk about the Catawba and the American Revolution. This, of course, the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution is kind of ongoing for the next several years. So there's been a big push, particularly in South Carolina and North Carolina, for the Southern campaign. Lots of stuff's happening, and very pleasantly, there's a big push to document and recognize groups of people who were in the Revolution who have not perhaps been as fully recognized and documented as before, such as Native Americans, African Americans, and so on. So the Catawba played a pretty big part in the Revolution. So the Catawba were the only Native tribe to fight on the Patriot side from the very beginning of the war throughout the very end. Now, the big question of that is why? Because historically, the Catawba had been pretty strong allies for the British. If you go back to 1714, 1715, during the Yamasee War, the Catawba provided the largest number of warriors in that uprising against the British colonies. This is really where the Catawba's reputation among the colonists for military prowess comes from, the Yamasee War. And after that, the Catawba, because that failed, by the way, after that, the Catawba determined that they were never rising up against the British colonies was just not a good idea. It was not going to win. The Catawba, particularly during the 1750s, 1760s, had a really shrewd leader known today as King Hagler. You may have recognized that name. His real name was Nopkahe. Hagler, we believe, was a British bastardization of Hagler because he was such a skilled diplomat. And he was really good at playing off the various colonial governors, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, against each other because they all wanted Catawba support in various military operations and against particularly other Native American tribes. The Catawba, at one point, there's a South Carolina governor who notes the Catawba were at that point at war with 11 different people. The Catawba and Cherokee historically have always butted heads. Back in the day, young warriors from the Iroquois Confederacy would make their way down to South Carolina and North Carolina Piedmont in order to fight a Catawba warrior, because if you could defeat a Catawba warrior, you'd really made your bones as a young warrior. So there was a lot of warfare, and that's what you hear about a lot, but the important thing to remember is that wasn't constant. So yes, the Catawba and the Cherokee butted heads a lot over the years. But when they weren't butting heads, they were also trading. They were also intermarrying. They were also, working together. It's kind of like when somebody brings me a projectile point and says, is this Catawba? I have no way to tell because A, I don't know where it was found. But B, if the Catawba came up with a better arrowhead, 3 days later, the Cherokee were making that arrowhead. So it's a big kind of misconception that I think a lot of us grow up with, that Native American tribes are very insular and insulated from each other, when actually they were trading and traveling and talking to one another. Catawba potsherds have been found all the way up into Maine and southern Canada and all the way down to Florida. So you had that entire East Coast trading going on. So the Yamasee War, you get the reputation for the militarism and being really good scouts and soldiers. Come the French and Indian War, which was kind of the North American part of the 7 Years' War, the Catawba sided with the British. The Cherokee sided with the French, much to the Cherokees' dismay in the end. So during the French and Indian War, they particularly fought with a young colonel named George Washington, militia colonel in the Ohio River Valley. They were so valued by Washington as scouts and skirmishers that there are surviving letters from him to the governors of Virginia and the Carolinas asking for more Catawba to be sent and to be sure to get them guides to come up with. As part of the French and Indian War, there was this little subset of a British Cherokee War, and of course the British enlisted the Catawba heavily to fight in that. So the Catawba were well aware of British and British colonial military power. The Catawba had benefited from British colonial power. After the end of the French and Indian War, they were granted by the Crown of England a 144,000-acre reservation. Now, this also required the Catawba to give up their claims on their other historic land, but this was the first time they had had the full agreement to say, King George was like, this is your land, period, end of statement. So they knew that the British were powerful. They'd seen them beat the French. They'd been beaten by the British. They'd done well by fighting for the British, so why would they fight for the Patriots? So whenever you're asking these kind of questions about a Native American tribe, I find it useful always to think in terms of survival. Because by the time we get to the late 18th century, the 1770s, we are talking about, particularly with the Catawba, a tribe that was surrounded by settlers very, very early. The 144,000 acre reservation, that's the square on the map you see there. Side note, you will notice that in the border of North Carolina, even unto this day, there is this perfect 90-degree square cut out just kind of south of Charlotte. If you remember your maps? Well, that's because when they were dividing Carolina into North and South, North Carolina didn't want anything to do with Catawba. They wanted to make sure all of the Catawba were in South Carolina and thereby South Carolina's problem. That's the border of the reservation at the time. And so that is why the states have that 90-degree cutout. Because North Carolina had the Cherokee to deal with, and they didn't want to deal with the Cherokee and the Catawba. So they're surrounded by white settlers. Surrounded. They're already encroaching on that reservation because, surprise, surprise, the colonial government and colonial courts weren't really that interested in kicking squatters and white settlers off of native land. Shocker. So the Catawba in 1759 had been hit by a smallpox epidemic that wiped out at least half of the tribe. And we throw this around, this epidemic knocked out half of a tribe. When you think about this and about how devastating this is, remember that the Catawba, as most Native American tribes were, including the Cherokee at this point, were an oral-based tradition and oral-based histories. So all of the traditions, all of the histories, all of the family lines, this is all passed down from word of mouth from generation to generation. All of the information about what plants were good for, what diseases and what injuries, everything. Now, what happens when in one summer, half of the population is killed off? Largely the old and the young. You have that break in that oral tradition. And so you have that break in history and in culture and in stories and in legends and in everything. So when you hear about, in the mid-1800s, there were smallpox epidemics that wiped out half of a tribe A or tribe B or tribe C, this is devastating. This is in many ways unrecoverable. When, I've been trained as classically in the European schools of history and the American schools of history as a classical historian, and Catawba history as an archivist can be very frustrating because there are blank spots that will never be filled because it's just not there. There will never be a document. There will never be a piece of papyrus that explains stuff. It's just oral tradition and blank. So by the time of 1774-ish, the Catawba tribe was small, still had a high reputation as warriors. Their big trading thing with the colonial powers was deer skin in particular. But right around their area, the deer pretty much started to be hunted out. So they were kind of in an economically precarious position. Plus, the British had forced the Iroquois and the Cherokee to declare peace, so now the Iroquois could just come down, camp out on Cherokee lands, and raid the Catawba, so the Catawba couldn't go hunting farther afield because they'd be prey to the Iroquois warriors. So they're becoming more and more kind of dependent on their relationship with the surrounding settlers. Now, one of the fascinating bits about the Revolution in the South Carolina backcountry is that in 1774, the budding patriot revolutionaries in Charleston made this really incredible effort over a year's time to propagandize in the South Carolina backcountry. And the settlers around the Catawba homelands shifted from basically being loyalists, being Tories, to having a much more pro-revolutionary, pro-patriot stance. So, okay, the Catawba are now living amongst white people who are leaning towards revolution. And they are surrounded by these people. It's okay. You also have some government shenanigans on the colonial side. Price gouging. They weren't getting as much for their trade items as they should be. The South Carolina Commons House of Assembly changed the way they dealt with Catawba delegations. It used to be that Catawbas could come down to the assembly in Charleston and be treated, and you'd be treated well, and they would exchange gifts and trade, and this was a very good way for the Catawba to keep supplied. But that changed. They could only come by invitation now, and that was a big deal. And of course, we already mentioned the white squatters not being removed, and again, largely surrounded by the pro-patriot forces. So you're a small tribe living in this situation. You're going to lean more towards the political side of your neighbors, because if things do blow up, and you're not on their side, then you are in a bad situation. So survival is a big part of any question when you're asking why a tribe reacted in a certain way to certain events. So the Catawban, trying to figure out what was going on between these crazy white people, had two different kind of approaches going on towards them. The British wanted the tribes to stay out of it, but to stay loyal to the crown. It's our business. We're gonna handle this. You just stay out of it, but stay loyal to us. The Patriot forces actively recruited. The Patriots actively went amongst the Catawba and the Cherokee and tried to get them on side. Now, various promises were exchanged. We would, of course, honor the reservation treaty. You would still keep the 144,000 acres. We would do a much better job of, keeping white settlers off, and we would not do this price gouging. Come with us, because of course the Patriots too were aware of the Catawba's military skill, and of course the Catawba's knowledge of the South Carolina backcountry. So, the Catawba ultimately, in July 4th, 1775, sent a delegation to Charleston to find out what's going on. This delegation was led by the young warrior who we believe to be Captain / Colonel John Ayres. And here we're running into an interesting bit of Catawba titles. Traditionally, King Hegler. The Catawba leaders had the title of king. Because, of course, Britain has king. Britain has king. So if the Catawba are negotiating with the British, well, we have a king too. So it kind of, puts you on that, equal diplomatic footing. King. Well, okay, they start to side with Patriots. Patriots don't have kings. And at this point, not really a president, there's no really United States. Talking in a minute. So, all right, apparently we're okay. So, sorry for all the interruptions, technology. So, the Patriots don't have kings or princes or dukes or whatever. So, the closest thing they have are generals and colonels and captains. So you start to see Catawba leaders take military titles, military rank titles as titles. So the primary leader and war leader of the Catawba during the Revolution was named New River, known as General New River. He's named New River, by the way, because he killed a Shawnee chief in a hand-to-hand combat on the New River, and took that name to mark the occasion and never let anybody call him anything else. So New River. So Captain Colonel John Ayres. During the Revolutionary War, John Ayres was captain. After the war, he was the leader of a particular village. It was known as Ayrestown by archaeologists, and he was referred to as colonel. Indicating, so these aren't actual military ranks. These are military ranks adopted as title by the Catawba to indicate that they are leaders to this new, very strange, kingless organization that would become the United States. So that's Young Warrior. So they went to Charleston to try and find out what exactly was going on with these white people, why they were about to fight, and where they should probably land, and ask for a letter to carry back to Catawba to explain things. So this was kind of what they were offered. They were actually intercepted by the first people to get to them was the Committee of Safety, the South Carolina Revolutionary Committee. And you find these communities all over the cities up and down the East Coast in Revolution. So they got them first, and they offered them some pretty good terms, improved trading. If they fought for them, they would pay them like regular militiamen, 10 shillings a day, plus supplies, of course, for the ammunition and arms. And of course, there was always the threat of reprisals if you didn't side with the Patriot forces. The quote is, your case and our cause is just the same. We're fighting for the same thing. But if you do not mind what we say, you will be sorry for it by and by. So we're fighting for the same thing. We're fighting for freedom. But you better fight for us, because otherwise, they're working together. So there was that whole carrot and stick thing going there. So the Catawba went back and taking in what they'd been told by the Revolutionary Guard, if you will, and everything they knew about their situation surrounding them, they decided that they would go with the Patriot side. So by the late summer of 1775, the Catawba were already in the field in the backcountry. They were taking down loyalists as part of William Thompson's Rangers at that point. So from 1775 onward, the Catawba were fighting for the Patriots. A lot of changes were brought about by the revolution for the Catawba. The abdication of King Prow was the last king of the Catawbas. We don't know whether Prow stepped aside or whether he was usurped. But General New River arose as the primary Catawba chief and war leader. It's worth noting here that Catawba chiefs traditionally were elected by council and various councils of various towns. The Catawba were a town-based people. But they were elected from a group of potential candidates who had some sort of connection to what you might think of as a royal line. And the Catawba were matrilineal and matrilocal. So that royal line was counted as descent through the mother's side of the family. And matrilocal is when you got married, the wife didn't move in with the husband's family, the husband moved in with the wife's family. Women were always in control of Catawba land, of Catawba farming, of where and how the houses were built. That's just how it was. So New River marries Sally New River. Sally New River supposedly was the granddaughter of King Hagar, so she belonged to that royal line. So New River, we believe, was able to move into that leadership position through marriage. He might not have, he wasn't matrilineally through that line, but by marriage, he was related to it. He was also a proven war leader, the Shawnee chief at New River. So that's, we think, how New River got kind of elevated to the position that he held. Again, we've already talked about the institution of military titles, military ranks as titles. And there was, in 1780, the entire tribe temporarily migrated to Virginia to escape the coming of the British after Charleston fell, and they put Catawba lands to fire and sword. More on that later. And again, the destruction of Catawba farmlands by British forces in the 1780s. So lots of big changes for the Catawba. The destruction of their lands would take forever to recover from. These are a list of the known battles that Catawba took part in, which pretty much is the Southern campaign of the Revolutionary War. There are probably more. The Catawba has militiamen. Militiamen during the Revolution were not the most well-organized forces. And with Catawba as kind of native irregulars, were even a little less organized. So you often didn't have, units of Catawba, like a platoon of Catawba, we would say today. You might have that number of Catawba, or you might have like 2 or 3 or 4 acting as your scouts. You might have a few here and a few there. And as irregulars, the Catawba tended often to go home for a little bit and come back, which is how irregular forces throughout the world react. So we know the Catawba were at the battles listed here. We also know that they were involved and used as slave catchers during the war. During the war, the British offered freedom to any slave who would escape and come fight with them, which was a very attractive offer. And of course, the Patriots were not on that side of things. At least nominally, of course, if you joined the Continental Army, you would be free. But we're talking about South Carolina in the late 18th, early 19th century. So the Catawba were used because they knew the backcountry so well to track down slaves and return them to the various plantations. As well as in the Cherokee Wars, because again, knew the land, knew the enemy. That was the person you wanted during what would be kind of the start of the American Cherokee Wars in 1776. But then also involved in various battles, much with famous, including Kings Mountain. They did in Charleston fell in 1780, and then the Battle of Camden and Hanging Rock. Camden particularly was a defeat for the Patriots. And the British, as Cornwallis marched towards the backcountry, they reached out to the Catawba and said, either side with us or we will destroy you utterly. Catawba decided not to take the offer. In fact, famously, when General Thomas Sumter was retreating after the Battle of Charleston, and after the Battle of Charleston and Camden, pretty much the Patriot forces and Patriot military action in South Carolina backcountry was just almost done. If it weren't for Sumter, who kept things alive, he gathered forces, he carried on this kind of militia/guerrilla campaign, as well as the Swamp Fox too. But Sumter very, very specifically camped on Catawba lands. This is one of those places in history where reading between the lines, you see the women crop up. You remember I told you that they were in charge of the land and the houses and all this kind of stuff. Well, one of the reasons Sumter chose Catawba lands was he could get resupplied there. And there are stories of friendly natives driving cattle to supply Sumter's forces. And what we know here, this was the Catawba women who were gathering corn and gathering grain, and gathering cattle, gathering deerskins, and they would take them to Sumter's forces to help them resupply and reprovisioning of his forces to help the Patriots continue the war in South Carolina. So this was a very important role that the women played. In many ways, that kind of campaign wouldn't have been possible without that support of the Catawba women helping to supply. Now, as the British moved forward, the Catawba absolutely believed that the British would just lay waste to their lands. They knew the British. They knew that this was not an idle threat. So once again, the women organized everybody who was at home. Organized women, organized the children, organized the elders, figured out what they could carry, how to carry it, and then all of the Catawba warriors took leave from their militia duties. And the entire tribe moved from that square area in South Carolina all the way up into southern Virginia. We believe they stayed with the Pamunkey people in Virginia, who actually, I think, just recently got their federal recognition. The Catawba and the Pamunkey had been trading partners and had intermarried for centuries to this point, so there was a standing relationship there. So the entire tribe moved up to Virginia. The warriors were back in time for the Battle of Kings Mountain, and then to fight on through, all the way through Guilford Courthouse in Eutaw Springs. And the tribe, after the British defeat, came back down. The land was laid waste. Any livestock left had been confiscated, or what the British didn't carry off and use, they killed, burned all the houses, took all the crops when they couldn't carry, they burned down. It was laid waste, and it took decades for the Catawba to even come close to recovering from this. But the actual logistics of moving that tribe, moving the entire people away out of harm's reach, is brilliant. And again, that's where the women came in, because the men were all fighting. So we know who had to organize all this. And that would be women. Again, one of those things in history, you got to read between the lines. If you did, they're there. These are, to date, the names of the Catawbas who served in the American Revolution. This is an area of research that is ongoing. This largely comes from a Captain Brennan's list, a pay bill of 1783, when the Catawba militiamen were trying to get their pay from the young U.S. government. I have no doubt that there are other names that are not on this list. In letters from various people in small repositories all across North and South Carolina, part of my ongoing project is visiting these and going through. But oftentimes it is just, a name or two in a letter that we piece together. But these, and you can recognize some of the names that come down even today: the Harrises, the Ayres, Browns, the Cantys, the Scotts. The Redheads ultimately left the Catawba tribe and married in with the, blanking on which tribe they married into, but the Redhead name passed out of the Catawba people. But yeah, so a lot of these names are, are the direct ancestors of a lot of people that you see today on the reservation, and that's Catawba tribes. Actually, Piney George, or Pine Tree George, was actually my boss, Dr. Ramona George Hare, is a direct descendant of Piney George, who was the only Catawba to serve as a regular in the Continental Army. All the rest of them served as militiamen. And of course, like many regulars in the Continental Army, he never really had pension response. So we have some information on him writing those letters appealing for his pension. So, for a while, their service in the Revolution served the Catawba very well. In 1790, the state of South Carolina had silver gorgets struck. And a gorget is a kind of insignia or medallion worn around the neck. Gorgets had been part of the Catawba culture and southeastern native culture for centuries, usually bone or wood. These, of course, were struck in silver. They were given to supposedly every veteran who fought from South Carolina. This is the Piney George gorget. We have this gorget at the Catawba Cultural Center. It was recovered several years ago from a white family who had looted it from the gravesite. To date, we only know, I think, of 2, maybe 3 other gorgets that are all in private hands, more than likely from looting at some point or another. The neat thing about this gorget is if you flip it over, which you can see at the Cultural Center, on the back, obviously probably done by Piney George and not the silversmith, are engravings of black snakes. Because to the Catawba, the black snake is a powerful symbol of protection. And great Catawba warriors, probably General Moon River, Colonel John Ayers, would have black snakes, 2 black snakes tattooed like on the top of their shoulder blades down to their waist. And those kinds of tattoos were only given to great warriors and warriors. Interestingly enough, if you look at the famous painting, The Death of General Wolfe, which is about the Battle of Quebec during the French and Indian War, and it's all the central focus, of course, is this well-dressed dying British general. The leader in the foreground, kneeling, is a Native American, and the dress and the snake tattoos on that figure, placed there by the artist, are 100% Catawba. Likely, the painting, of course, was done years after the battle, and likely this man got his reference models from Catawba warriors, and knowing that Catawba fought on the British side. But in that painting, you can see Catawba kneeling there with black snake tattoos. But that's why they're inscribed on the back of the gorget, because they are very powerful warrior symbols, protective symbols to the Catawba. You will see it on Catawba pottery, what are called snake bowls. Basically, your bowls are figures with a snake wound around. Now, some theories are that has, when you put milk in a pitcher or you put grain in a pitcher, the black snake would come along and wind itself around the container, and it would get any critters that tried to get to the grain, mice or whatever. The black snake would get it. So, kind of a natural symbol of protection there. Now, I mentioned that the Catawba were very popular and held in high regard by Colonel George Washington during the French and Indian War. Well, not too long after the American Revolution, despite all the promises, the white settlers started encroaching on Catawba lands again. First, the Catawba attempted to use the white legal system to their advantage. They created deeds of land, and they deeded all of their land to Sally New River and the other Catawba women. Very unusual for women to hold land deeds during this period of time. And so their plan was, okay, we'll lease the land. That way we can get income, land still remains ours. But of course, the nasty American courts and state authorities didn't have much interest in enforcing those against the white people. Again, shocker. So 1796, George Washington, now President of the United States, is touring this area of the country. So a bunch of Catawba veterans put on their green militia coats. They were very proud. Green militia coats, and intercepted George Washington on the road to ask for his help against with all these broken promises and white settlers on their land. So George responded to the letter to his Secretary of State that he had been incommoded, great word, at this place by a visit of several days from a party of a dozen Catawbas. And he should wish that during the rest of this retreat to avoid repetition of such guests. So that was his response to the people reminding him of their service under him during the French Indian War and their good service in the Revolution. And George didn't have much interest in all of that. Worth noting, of course, that during the French Indian War, George bought a bunch of land west of the Appalachians. And then, of course, after that war, the British said, no, we're not going further west. That's Indian land. You know, the Appalachians the line, and George and other big landowners and land speculators at that time really wanted to get to that side and make some money on that land. So, a little bit of history there. And that's basically it. This is, you can scan the QR code if you want, or just reach out to me at archives@catawba.com. And come see us and visit us. And again, the festival's 23rd. I have very few minutes because I'm talky to take questions. I will be happy to answer anything I can, whether it's Revolutionary War related or not.
Yes, King Hagler. Was he king when John Lawson came through in 1700?
No, Hagler, you're talking, he died in 1763. In a Shawnee ambush. So he was king during the French and Indian War, so 1750s. Actually only became king because the current king and the best candidates above him, like the kind of ranking candidates, were all killed in Shawnee raid, coming back from Charleston. So Hagler was kind of the last guy left, and I left it that way. But no, he was mid.
Do we know a name of who Lawson met?
Who what?
Lawson, John Lawson.
No, we do not. Lawson is kind of sketchy with names. And we don't, the earliest king that we know the name of goes back to 1714. I will not even attempt to pronounce that name. It starts with W, it goes on for about 20 letters. But that is the earliest named king we have for the Catawba.
Is that gorge that you displayed the very one that is on the South Carolina flag?
No, not to my knowledge. That's not based on that. It was a common military award at the time, and of course it was well known to the natives. But I mean, even today, in certain European dress uniforms, and particularly Germans, like sergeants have gorges. Particularly like high-ranking NCOs will still in dress uniforms have gorges or something.
Oh, you said they were good warriors. What did they use?
Well, during the Revolution, of course, the Catawba were very proud of their rifles. And that was part of it. It was also part of Hagler's negotiations after the smallpox epidemic and the deer shortage. Part of that was getting modern arms and supplies for the Catawba in return for promises of military support. So they were using the same kind of muskets, and particularly in the Revolution, rifles that Americans would be using militia. And sometimes more modern equipment than a lot of the militiamen just used what they came from home. So, of course, during previous eras, bows and arrows, of course, ferocious hand-to-hand combat. If you've ever seen the film The Patriot, for all of its historical inaccuracies, the depictions of hand-to-hand combat, very upfront, face-to-face, incredibly violent and brutal. That's very true. So of course, the Catawba being war axes and various implements of hand-to-hand combat as well. Yeah.
This today, if somebody created a written language.
Yes, it uses the Latin alphabet with some various diacritical markers. Unlike the Cherokee and Sequoia, who created an entirely new alphabet, all languages written using our standard Latin alphabet with a few different letters. It is a written language. Our language coordinator, this cool thing where I now have a separate keyboard with all the funky letters and the diacritical marks, so that when I'm typing and using the Catawba words, I can just really quickly put it in there. It's very cool. Our language department's Awesome.
Do we have any musical instruments?
Yes, the big one, water drums, which were made of it was a big pot. It's kind of like, have you ever seen the djembe, the kind of drum traditional, but this was made out of a clay pot with skin stretched across the top of the pot, had a little bit of water in it for the reverb. Also tortoiseshell rattles, turtle shell rattles. Usually the box turtle is used. Today they don't use the box turtle because it is not quite endangered, but borderline. There are a lot of us on the Catawba Reservation most days going to work. Somebody stops traffic to move the turtle out of the road. So yes, and there's someone in the back.
Yes, as a member of the DAR, do you know if any Catawbas of today have traced their lineage and become members of local chapters of the DAR?
I do not know. I can't say for certain. I mean, I do know that my director, Dr. Ruben Hare, is a direct descendant from Pine George, but I do not think she is a member of the DAR. I'm working with a member of the DAR now. The DAR has at their library in DC lists of Catawba names, supposedly. Getting access to that as a non-member is kind of interesting, but we're working on that. So it's kind of, you build the names of lists.
I just want to encourage that really DAR is looking for
Right.
a diverse group. Actually in DC, we have lists of Native Americans and Black Americans and Spanish and French. We are very much looking to diversify the DAR. So really encouraging anybody who can trace it back with help. Find a local chapter, and we have people in each of the chapters that will work with you to do the research.
I will take the message.
What kind of dwellings do you live
Okay, so traditional Catawba dwellings were called bark houses. What they would do, they were circular, and they would be made with saplings would make the uprights and the horizontals to a circular house, and then the exterior would be made with kind of overlapping plates of bark taken from trees, like big slabs, and those kind of overlap so that the water would not come in. The top would be thatched. Everything would be sealed up with what we call log daub today. Generally an open hole in the ceiling for the fire pit in the middle. Raised sleeping/sitting platforms around the perimeter, which are made of wood, handcrafted, and the earlier skins, then blankets. And very early on in Catawba, we began to live in the settler fashion with your classic log cabins, wooden houses, stuff like that. We know from Catawba town sites that very early, 1720s, maybe a little earlier, we have sites that have moved from the what's called like a flexed burial, where the body's buried kind of in a fetal position. And so you've got these oval graves to the more standard, rectangular colonial gravesite systems. So I mean, influence surrounded very early, definitely by the time of the Revolution, probably by the 1720s. So you have very early interaction with and adoption of colonial practices, cultures, and technology. Thank you so much for coming and for putting up with me and our talk.